Hello, government students. Today we're going to talk about the various powers and duties of the President of the United States. Starting off with this picture you see here, which shows President Biden in front of what I believe are graduating cadets from the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. And that sort of represents one of the President's duties, that is, being the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of America. And with that, let's go ahead and get started with the President's powers and duties. There are basically 5 types of presidential power, and we're going to go into each of these in some detail. But that would be executive power, diplomatic power, military power, and legislative power. And the executive power we're going to start with, and that comes from Article 2, Section 1, Clause number 8. And you don't have to write these quotes from the Constitution down, but for each of these powers I will state where the power comes from within the Constitution. But when we're talking about executive power, what we're talking about really is down here in the bottom of this slide. The main job of the president is to execute or carry out the constitutional duties that are given to him by the Constitution. So there are 3 types of executive power. First of all, there is the power of executing the laws. There is also ordinance power, and there is also appointment power. So let's take a look at the first of those, executing the laws. The president must execute all federal laws. That is, he must enforce them, regardless of his personal opinion. There are a lot of laws, I suspect, on the books right now that President Biden may not be crazy about, but as President of the United States, he is to enforce or execute all of the laws. However, the president does have discretion in how he will go about enforcing these laws. He can prioritize where to distribute the resources of the government, and let's face it, the resources are limited. You don't have unlimited resources. So because of that, he can de-emphasize certain laws and emphasize others. And I'll give you a quick example. Theoretically, it is against the law to sell marijuana in the United States. There is a federal law that is against the sale of marijuana. However, many states have legalized the sale of marijuana within the boundaries of the states. Today, tomorrow, whatever, Biden could actually send the FBI and start enforcing the anti-marijuana laws if he chose to do so. He chooses not to do so, however. And that's because there's a lot more important things probably that the FBI can be doing other than shutting down marijuana distribution facilities. So he does have a lot of discretion. Some laws realistically do not get enforced, again, because the president has the power and the discretion on prioritizing which laws he wants to enforce. There are about 4,500 criminal laws, federal criminal laws. That's a lot. And again, this is why the president needs some discretion on which ones he's going to devote resources to. And in addition to all those federal criminal laws, there are a lot more laws that are not criminal in nature. So we really do have limited resources in order to address all the laws that are out there. By the way, that's why the government employs so many people. We have over 2 million federal employees, and that doesn't count the military, over 2 million non-military government employees. And many of those are involved in making sure that the duties of the president, that is in enforcement of laws, executing the laws, are carried out. So that's a lot of people, but it is not an unlimited number of people. So that leads to a question which I think it might be worth looking at. Is the government getting bigger or smaller? Obviously, the nation is growing. How does that reflect it in the size of our government, the number of people who actually work for the president? Let's take a look at this graph. It might surprise you. Let's go back to 1964. I was a small child in 1964. In fact, in 1964, I was in kindergarten. And when I was in kindergarten, we had 2.47 million employees, civilian employees, working for the federal government. The population of the United States was only 191.8 million at that time, and that means that there were 12.9 federal government employees for every 1,000 people in the United States. Look how this number has changed over time. In fact, in 1964, we had more civilian employees working for the government than we do now. But look at the difference in population. We've gone from 191.8 million people in 64 to about 330 million people today. That's a big increase, and yet fewer federal government employees. And now we only have 6.4 federal government employees for every 1,000 people. That means that is cut in half, basically, from what it was when I was a small child. So that might surprise you. Our government is getting much, much smaller, much, much more lean than it used to be. And especially that's the case when you consider how much larger the nation is today than it used to be. Next up is the Ordinance Power. This is still his executive power. And again, you don't have to write this down, but it comes from Article 2, Section 3, that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And it's that section that gives the president his ordinance power. So here's our definition. Ordinance power. It's the power to issue executive orders. What's an executive order? An executive order is a rule or regulation issued by the president that has the force of law. Okay, so an executive order is not a law, but it must be followed just as laws must be followed. So let's take a look at these ordinances and executive orders a little bit more. Congress gives the ordinance power to the president due to the number and complexity of the laws that it has passed. Remember, there's 4,500 criminal laws, and there's a lot more laws that are not criminal in nature. Congress simply cannot get into the amount of detail on the enforcement of all those laws, so they've given the president some leeway here. Most executive orders that the president issues simply concern or specify how laws will be implemented. President Obama issued in 8 years 276 executive orders. That means he exercised his ordinance power 276 times in 8 years. President Trump, in 4 years in office, had 220 executive orders, almost as many as Obama had in 8 years. And now, as I'm making this video in April of 2022, President Biden has been in office about 1 year and 3 months, and he has issued, as of this date, 88 executive orders. He is on track to have about the same number of executive orders as President Trump had, which was a lot, a whole lot. And I would say that many of President Biden's executive orders, many of them were simply canceling some of President Trump's executive orders. Okay, and here's an example of an executive order. You don't need to write this down, but remember what I said. An executive order is usually detailing or specifying how a law is going to be enforced. So here's one. By the authority vested in me as President of the United States, or by the Constitution, and by the laws of the United States of America, including the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the National Emergencies Act, and the Nationality Act of 1952. Notice he's specified 3 different laws here. And then he says, and also Section 301 of Title III of the United States Code, I, Joseph Biden, hereby order. So what's happening in this executive order, Obama, President Biden is specifying which laws he is addressing with the executive order. And with this executive order, then he will specify how we will enforce those laws. And his order will carry the force of law. That is, this executive order has to be followed as if it were a law. All right, next up is the appointment power. The appointment power is from Article 1 as well, and it says that the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and other offices of the United States. This is, again, from Article 1 of the Constitution. So what does that mean? The president's appointment power includes appointing ambassadors and other important diplomats. It includes appointment of cabinet members and other top aides. The cabinet members, by the way, are people like the Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Attorney General, those types of people. It includes judges and the heads of executive agencies That would be things like the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission. These are these important executive departments that are, focused on certain areas of our nation's needs. Power number 2, we've just finished up with the executive powers. Now let's go to power number 2, diplomatic power. This includes making treaties, and treaties also require 2/3 approval of the Senate. That's a pretty tough threshold. And it includes executive agreements, which are pacts or agreements made between the heads of government that carry the weight of law. An executive agreement does not require Senate approval, and oftentimes they're related to how a ratified treaty is going to be processed or implemented or executed. You can think of the executive agreements are to treaties as an executive order is to a law, okay? But again, they do carry the force of law, but they do not require Senate approval. Recognition is another diplomatic power. Recognition is where the president recognizes the legal existence of another nation state. We do not recognize, for example, North Korea. Now, North Korea exists, there's no question about that, but we do not recognize North Korea's legal existence. We say that North Korea is a rogue state, that its government has no legal right to exist. It's a very repressive government. We don't recognize them. So, how do we use this power of recognition? Well, first of all, we use the power to punish rogue states such as North Korea or Iran. These are states that we do not recognize today. And by not giving them recognition, it limits what kind of commerce and interaction can happen between our two countries. North Korea's economy, for example, would be much healthier, I am sure, if we recognize them. They would be able to engage in trade much more easily with the United States and we with them. But since we do not recognize them, that really makes it difficult for North Korea to take advantage of the huge markets that are available in the United States for their goods and services. We also use this power to help new states that come into existence. We did this way back over 100 years ago when Panama became an independent country. It had been a part of Colombia before, and we supported Panama's independence from Colombia, so we immediately recognized them. Also, much more recently, back about 10, 12 years ago, the Republic of South Sudan was created out of a big chunk of the nation of Sudan in Africa. And by giving them recognition, we're able to provide foreign assistance and aid to South Sudan, and we have tried to help them be a more successful new nation state. Okay, next up is our military power. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. That means that the President is the boss of the military. Military commanders must obey the President, and in fact, if they don't obey the President, they are being insubordinate, and that's grounds for court-martial. So yeah, that's a big deal. In fact, an officer in the United States military is not allowed to offer public criticism of the president. Any officer, and that's down as low as a lieutenant, they are not allowed to publicly criticize the president. If they do, they will likely be fired, and that does happen sometimes. We've had several generals, high generals, fired for criticizing the president of the United States, not necessarily President Biden, but previous presidents. Military power includes declaring war. Now, the president actually does not declare the war, but he does have the power to ask Congress to declare a war. Okay, so the president needs to ask Congress to declare war. And we also have undeclared wars today. In fact, the last declared war we had was World War II. We have had undeclared wars going all the way back to 1798 when we had what's called the Quasi-War with France. This power has been used more than 200 times. Congress has turned over much of its war-making power to the president. Congress doesn't want to take the stand by formally declaring war. We'll just let the president do it. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 actually was passed. This was at the end of the Vietnam War. Basically, the president has the leeway to send troops into harm's way but he must get approval from Congress within 60 days. I'm going to stop this presentation now. There's going to be another video on Canvas continuing the powers of the president. Be sure to watch the second video.